On the night of November 2nd, 2025, at 2:17 a.m., Crimea entered the moment the Russian side believed the sky had been locked down. The 92N6E radar of the S-400 left limited emission mode, opened the scan volume fully, and pulled the entire air defense network into a heavy but familiar operating rhythm. And at that exact moment, ATACMS surged in like a kinetic mass carrying the full inertia of the modern battlefield. It did not merely cross space, it crushed reaction time. The processing chain had not yet closed before it was forced to break. Russia saw the distortion on the screens, but everything unfolded so fast that the action no longer had time to form. A few seconds later, the data was still there, but the Crimean sky had lost its ability to defend itself. On the operational map, Crimea was no longer terrain. It collapsed into a taut A2 AD dome, where sensors and firepower overlapped with no visible seams. Surveillance radars pushed the horizon upward. Data was forced into command centers, compressed into a single picture. At the center, 92N6E kept time for the entire network, pulling each track through clutter filters, locking priorities, and ready to open fire control gates. Behind it, AORL-1 AS and P. 18 Terek filled the remaining angles, keeping the Crimean sky permanently rendered. Launchers stood still, but every flight path through this area already had a calculated intercept point, where targets would be torn apart in mid-air before touching the ground. For Russia, the S-400 in Crimea did not merely control airspace. It decided whether an aerial attack would be crushed within a few dozen seconds or turn into a catastrophe over the Black Sea skies. But the dome could not stay stretched forever. Power had to rise and fall. Modes had to cycle. Tracking channels had to rotate to keep the picture intact. Each transition slowed the network for precisely one moment. Ukraine did not try to break the dome. They stood at the edge, counted every scan cycle, and followed each time the network was forced fully open. They waited for the moment the dome was stretched the tightest, which was also when latency was most exposed, at 2:10 a.m. On November 2nd, 2025, inside Ukraine's operations room, what ran across the screens was not terrain, but emission rhythm. It rose and fell exactly along cycles that had been tracked for far too long. No one needed to guess. They only had to wait for 92N6E to step into the moment it had to truly open its eyes. Around 2:12 a.m., a few thin tracks touched the edge of the tracking zone. Not heavy enough to alarm the system, but enough to keep the radar active longer than planned. The picture remained clean, carrying only a sense of being stretched. Each time the system delayed, an update window slid past like a heartbeat being squeezed. By around 2:14 a.m., the order to increase surveillance arrived. Power climbed, fan-shaped scan space was re-established. Order returned, clearer, denser, and therefore slower. To reach fire control, the system had to pass through all confidence lock windows. There were no shortcuts. Around 2:16 a.m., ATACMS entered the engagement window, forcing itself directly into what remained of the S-400's reaction time. It did not seek priority. It compressed the timeline. When the target signature became just sufficient to trigger a classification upgrade, the update window had already slipped past, the channel was still occupied, and fire control conditions had not yet locked. And in exactly one brief beat, coverage lost continuity. Around 2:16 a.m., across the Crimean air defense network, the tracking picture still appeared intact. The 92N6E fire control radar continued to hold its scan rhythm, pulling data from dozens of low-altitude target tracks scattered across the coverage zone. On the screens, everything looked dangerously familiar. Enough signals, enough layers, enough order to believe the sky was still under control. That very familiarity began to betray the system. The S-400 was designed to win by time. Targets reveal early. Remain in the scan volume long enough. Complete the full classification chain before transitioning to fire control. That chain was still running. But the time allocated to it had been cut short. A high-speed target appeared late, forcing itself straight into the middle of an old processing rhythm, while the system continued to behave as if it still had a few dozen seconds left to consider. On the lower tier, operators continued to do exactly what the system required. Tracks not yet stable enough were held for another cycle. Overlapping tracks were pushed to alternate channels to avoid mutual interference. Every action was logical. But with each action, tracking channels became more tightly locked, precisely as they turned into the scarcest resource. To pull a channel away from one target and reassign it to another, the system had to wait for the next scan cycle. And with every cycle that passed, the priority board shifted more slowly than the speed at which the target was closing in. At the C2 level, data continued to flow in for fusion. Signals from 92N6E were combined with auxiliary surveillance layers such as AORL-1AS and P18-TERIC. But fusion did not occur the instant data arrived. It had to wait for time synchronization. It had to filter duplicates. It had to be clean enough to open fire control conditions. Each wait consumed one more processing beat. As latency stretched, the threat board began to tremble. There was no sudden jump, just priorities swapping places repeatedly, as if the network itself was hesitating. Channels were stretched between two tasks, maintaining a stable picture and trying to open a valid engagement window. Each time the system attempted to upgrade a track, the condition chain failed to close fully. Missing one continuous beat, everything was pushed back down into the tracking layer. When the target signature crossed the classification threshold, it did not appear as a clear, bright point. It appeared as a discrepancy in the picture. Speed no longer matched UAV assumptions. Trajectory no longer resembled weather clutter, but observation time was too short for the system to commit. Procedures still demanded proof, at least one adjacent update window. And at that exact moment, the scan cycle slipped past, while tracking channels were still allocated according to old logic. At this point, C2 began to realize in the technical sense. Priorities shifted, channel reassignment orders were issued downward. Nodes attempted to re-lock onto the target, to raise track confidence and open fire control gates. But the processing chain could not contract in time. What was entirely reasonable under normal conditions now became resistance. When the system attempted to transition from tracking to engagement, it hit congestion. The track was not sufficient to lock. Channels had not yet been freed. The next update window did not arrive in time to rescue the decision that had just slipped past. The picture still ran on the screens, but the ability to turn that picture into an interception action dropped below threshold, breaking in exactly one short beat. After 2:16 a.m., the S-400 network in Crimea did not go silent. Radars kept rotating. Data continued to flow in. On the screens, the sky was still rendered, but from that moment, the system could no longer convert what it saw into a valid interception decision in time. The problem was not with the launchers. In the S-400, launchers do not generate engagements on their own. Every decision must pass through the control chain, where fire control radar and command posts lock targets into fire control conditions. When that control linkage is disrupted, the chain does not collapse loudly. It is cut precisely at the final segment. The tracking picture remains, but the path from tracking to engagement closes in operational terms. From there, the system begins to slide downhill according to its own logic. Targets already under tracking do not disappear immediately. They lose something more critical: the ability to maintain continuity across successive processing cycles. When a target is not confirmed seamlessly, the system does not push it into engagement. It holds it, it waits, and every wait consumes another beat of time. Tracking channels remain locked according to familiar procedures. Targets not yet stable are held for another cycle. Overlapping tracks are shifted to alternate channels to avoid conflict. In theory, every action is correct. In reality, they slow the network precisely when speed is no longer available. Tracking channels become a scarce resource, while the priority board reshuffles more slowly than the situation advances. At the command level, data continues to be pulled in from auxiliary surveillance layers, but data does not close itself into a decision. Fusion requires time synchronization, stable duplicate filtering, and an anchor point strong enough to lock. When that anchor can no longer hold rhythm, updates begin to arrive out of phase. Some arrive one cycle late, some match spatially but not temporally. Some are correct but not continuous enough to open fire control conditions. The system responds as designed. Do not lock, hold, wait. Within a few dozen seconds, the picture on the screens becomes perceptually deceptive. Everything is still running, but nothing qualifies to proceed. Targets are promoted and then dropped. Priorities shift continuously without locking decisions. Intercept windows open and slide past before closing. The processing chain still operates, but it runs to recheck, not to act. When recovery procedures are triggered, the network is forced to resynchronize from the beginning. That very process creates additional latency. While the system attempts to pull its processing rhythm back into stability, the external rhythm continues to change faster. The gap between the two rhythms widens, with no way to compensate in the remaining time. By the end of 2:17 a.m., the coverage zone on the map still appeared as a complete dome. But in real operation, that dome was only geometry. Data arrived fragmented. Targets failed to maintain rhythm. And in that exact moment, there was no longer a single window clean enough, continuous enough, or correctly timed to turn the tracking picture into a real interception order. By near dawn, UAV feeds and satellite imagery confirmed only one thing. The deployment area had not been wiped out, but it had lost operational rhythm. Some vehicles were still in place, some antennas were still standing, some command vehicles were still maneuvering. However, what was no longer present was the seamless reaction chain that allowed the air defense network to move from detection to interception in a single unified beat. The signature lay in how the network responded after the strike. The detect fuse lock fire control chain no longer ran continuously. New tracks appeared later, required more confirmation cycles to reach the stable tracking standard. Targets that had previously been prioritized were not upgraded further, but were held at the tracking layer for one more cycle. The time between decisions stretched, not because of a lack of data, but because of a lack of clean continuity sufficient to lock. In the hours that followed, neighboring units were forced to stretch their coverage to compensate for the gap. Radars had to stay on longer, rotate more slowly between modes to keep the picture from breaking. That increased the emission signature while also pulling in greater latency and re-establishing tracks. What had once been a stable overlap zone between sensor layers began to thin, then lose continuity by cycle. At the command level, refusing data no longer happened in a familiar single beat. Updates arrived out of phase, forcing the system to hold tracks for one more cycle before deciding. Each such cycle not only consumed time, but pushed the entire network into a slower response state than the rhythm of the next raid. The blind spot did not appear because the sky went silent. It appeared because the speed of turning data into action fell below the necessary operational threshold. On the map, the coverage zone. From that night of November 2nd, 2025, Crimea was no longer a seamless air defense block. It became a space where every emission cycle had to be recalculated, every radar-on interval, every decision to hold or drop a tracking channel. Not because of a lack of assets, but because any opening of the eyes also meant placing oneself inside a processing rhythm that could be exploited. What Ukraine demonstrated was not in the speed of a missile, but in the ability to force the opponent to operate according to the habits of their own system. When an air defense network must choose between silence to survive and emission to control the sky, superiority is no longer absolute. It becomes a time problem. And in that equation, half a beat late is enough for advantage to change hands.